Welcome to tonight's MACRI Talk, Chicago Latina Trailblazers, Testimonios of Political Activism. Let us know where you're joining from, and please welcome our special guests for this edition of Women's History Month MACRI Talk. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. And so pleased. Oh, we've got a lot of background noise. I'm so pleased to have our guests with us tonight. We are joined by guest Dr. Leticia Villarreal Sosa, Virginia Martínez, and Mary Gonzales. And unfortunately, Ada Nivia Lopez, our fourth announced speaker, is unable to join us, and we hope you feel better very soon. Our special guests tonight are influential leaders who have advocated for their communities and shaped the history of Chicago for decades. Their testimonials are featured in this anthology, Chicago Latina Trailblazers, and I'll put the link to that in the chat in a minute. And it's edited by Dr. Leticia Villarreal Sosa, one of our guests tonight, along with Rita Hernandez and Elena Gutierrez. So I want to introduce Dr. Villarreal Sosa, and then she'll introduce the rest of us. Dr. Villarreal Sosa is currently Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development and Professor of Social Work at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And she's going to tell us more about the project and our future guests. Welcome, everyone.
Well, welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I was asked to say a little bit about the book and my role in the book. And so really, as Sarah mentioned, I was one of the editors of the book. And so I wrote the proposal, helped to gather the stories. But really, our job was to make sure that these stories were published and that they were in print, to offer that inspiration and hope and lessons learned for both current leaders and future leaders. So as a collective really of authors and editors, we offer this tapestry of Latina leadership and activism as a challenge, right, to the racial and gender stereotypes and negative representations and actual just outright exclusion of many of the contributions of Mexican origin and Puerto Rican women. And if you want to put the slides up, this would be a good time to do so. We also just want to offer these stories to provide a hope and strategies for the ongoing work that's necessary to ensure the well-being of our communities, particularly in this political context. So you can go to the next slide. So to tell you a little bit about this is a book that's a collection of 14 testimonios of Mexican American and Puerto Rican women in Chicago. And these are women who are active in their communities and in local politics from the 1940s to current times. So, many women are still, or actually I should say, all women are still active now, right, in terms of continuing to address the social injustices that our communities face. The women in this book were selected due to their vision, their sense of community, and the impact that they made in either social services and education and politics. Many of the women were founders of some of the very first social service, policy, and educational organizations in Chicago. So I would say this book was a culmination of years of working along with a collective of trailblazers. It was an oral history project in the Latina feminist tradition. It included a lot of small group and collective conversations amongst the women and the editors. The Trailblazers, really contributed to the vision for this manuscript and its emphasis on how, as Latinas, they claimed a space and the respect and the human rights for the Chicago's Latino community. And so reclaiming language and speaking in their own voices was an important theme in their testimonios. The Trailblazers really pushed back on experiences of racialization, of sexism, of classism, and took control of the narrative of what leadership looked like for them. And this was in the context of often not having someone else that looked like them to sort of model, right, how to reach their vision or how to do this work. And these women were really trailblazers, right? And so many things that my generation later, did in terms of, for example, the coalition building or the transnational, what we call, transnational feminism, or like these women were doing this before we even had words for them, right? And so so they really kind of share their testimonios, and they document, right, speaking truth to power, and more importantly their actions, right, their actions to address the needs of the Latino community and really other vulnerable communities as well, both locally, nationally, and internationally. For the trailblazers included in this book, this was not just an opportunity to sort of claim a space in history, but really to use their own voice. And our goal here is to really share that experience with the world. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to share a little bit about the context in Chicago. As a response to the racialization that Latino communities experienced in Chicago, both the Mexican and Puerto Rican communities underwent this growing political consciousness and activism that's reflected in the testimonials of these women. As part of this commitment to community that they had, both groups developed social services, as I mentioned before, free health clinics, youth services. In Pilsen, a historical immigrant community in Chicago, a settlement house known as Howell House was opened in 1905. Then in 1970, it became Casa Aslan, and that's what you see here on the mural that would be on my left. I think as an audience, I think your left as well. Demonstrating a growing emphasis on culturally specific services and also Latina leaderships within these organizations. Because when these settlement houses were first developed, basically Mexican Americans were excluded, right, from leadership in these organizations, even though they were very important in servicing immigrant communities at the time. And there are a lot of parallels between Mexicans and Puerto Ricans in Chicago. They have a shared history as transnational labor migrants during and after World War II. Their settlement patterns in Chicago's near west side, and then being in communities that experience displacement from this area due to urban revitalization policies, race-based housing policies, federal highway constructions, all of these factors that shaped the lives of many of the women in this book. And the response to these policies and the continued experiences of racial discrimination in all aspects of social life led many of these women to their social activism. One of the things that I think is unique to the Chicago context or the experience, and also, as I mentioned before, the formation or forming of alliances with other groups. Ada, who couldn't be here today, just wanted me to share on her behalf the emphasis, right, and the importance of coalition building and how much we need that now. While Puerto Ricans and Mexicans also maintained a sense of pride, they maintained a sense of pride, right, with their national origins, even though they had developed this collective Latino-Latina identity. And many organizations such as Mujeres Latinas en Acción, the Young Lords, were intentionally inclusive and the women reflected that in their organizing strategies. So the women in the book provide insights into some of these dynamics and the work they did to be a bridge between groups in the process of advocating for things like bilingual education and the development of these services that I mentioned. So this particular slide has pictures of both the old mural and the new mural of Casa Aslan. So what had happened, the old mural was painted over in 2017 after a developer purchased the building, sparking outrage in the community. Patlan, the original artist, with help from other local artists, recreated the mural in the same year. And so the new mural is the one on the right. And in that mural, you see pictures of Guadalupe Reyes. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her when I introduce the women. She is Mary Gonzales's mother. And so she's going to speak to both her experience and her mother's experience. But quickly, Guadalupe Reyes was one of the women in the book and founder of El Valor. Go to the next slide. I wanted to share a little bit of testimonio, right? In the book title, it says Testimonios of Political Activism. And I wanted to just say a little bit, because I think this is something that in many ways in our community, we can all relate to. So testimonio is a term, obviously, that comes from Latin America itself. But it's really about telling life stories, but not just telling the stories, but reflecting on these stories and connecting our personal stories to the larger group struggle. The quote on the top is from Ana Castillo. She also has a chapter in this book, and she says, in one of her memoir, her book that's a memoir. She says, "What connects us not just as citizens from so many walks of life, but to our past and future, our stories. Day to day, we each form our narratives of survival, love, and of family." So I think that's particularly in our community as Latinos, Latinas, right? Our stories are so important. They are how we, part of our struggle, right? And how we share these stories of our individual stories and how they connect to this larger community and group struggle. So these stories are more than just narratives, right? They are a form of testimoniar, which is again about telling these life stories, reflecting on them, and connecting them to each other and to this larger group struggle. We name oppression and we disrupt it through this process of testimoniar. And so when we do this, right, in this process, we understand these lived experiences within this context of our social and political realities that we face every day, but we also build solidarity with each other. And it's about empowerment, right, and knowledge about political strategies that we can share with each other. Next slide. So again, their contributions, right? Their contributions ranged from community organizing, the development of key community institutions and organizations. Ana Castillo, for example, was the author of a seminal and critical text that really provided a foundation for future generations. Their participation in government at various levels was really important. Being a trailblazer meant that they were the firsts in certain spaces, created their own paths for leadership, and were creators of new organizations or public policies. So had these women not been involved as activists, organizers, policymakers, educators, essential institutions in Pilsen and Greater Chicago would likely not exist today. So their contributions were just really seminal and important in so many ways. Go ahead to the next slide. So now I have the honor of introducing the two women that are here with us today. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. First, I want to introduce the Trailblazers, Mary Gonzales, who's with us, and her mother, Guadalupe Reyes. So Guadalupe Reyes was born in 1918. She was the daughter of immigrants whose family worked as farm workers. She lost her mother very young, raised her siblings, married, had 11 children. One of whom was disabled. She was an activist in her daily life, demanding better living conditions for her children through community organizing. And Guadalupe is the founder of Esperanza, a school for children with disabilities, and El Valor, a social service organization serving Latina children and adults with disabilities and their families. She also organized senior citizens and led the campaign for a new field house at Harrison Park, one of the local parks in Pilsen. And as trustee of the Chicago Transit Authority, she led the fight for the reconstruction of the Blue Line, a train that served the Pilsen neighborhood. And then we have Mary Gonzales. Mary is a co-founder of Gamaliel, a national organization dedicated to building leadership and training groups to utilize power to create justice in their communities. She also co-founded Esperanza School and El Valor with her mother, Guadalupe Reyes. At El Valor, she waged a successful battle to obtain funds that support Latino adults with disabilities and founded the United Neighborhood Organization. Leading with Pilsen Neighborhood Community Council, there was the development of the 18th Street Corporation and opening of Benito Juarez High School. Now retired, Mary continues to do the work in multiple ways, right? And she mentors, young Latinos and Latinas to continue to build this legacy of organizers. You can go to the next slide. Next, we have Virginia Martínez. She was born and raised in Chicago. In 1975, she became one of the first two Latinas to be licensed to practice law in Illinois. That license allowed her to spend her career as a fierce advocate for Latinos, for women and children. She was a founding mother of the DePaul University Latino Law Student Association, and later served as regional counsel of the Midwest office of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, which we know as MALDEF, and executive director of Mujeres Latinas en Acción. She had the opportunity of being lead counsel in a historic Illinois redistricting case of 1982, which created the first Latino wards and legislative districts. Now she writes children's books to encourage parents and caregivers to read to their children and explore Chicago's many institutions. And then go to the last slide that I have. This is a quote from Lorena Cabnal. She's an indigenous woman that I met doing some of my international work in Guatemala. And she says, in the middle of this, meaning, these difficult political times, right? We are creating resistances. And I invite you, wherever you are, to be your own resistance. You will have a weaving, and we each take a new color to add that to the tapestry of universal justice. So as you listen to Mary's stories and Virginia's stories, I hope you think of this as an invitation. We want you to build on their work and Lorena Cabnal's work and the other women of the Chicago Latina Trailblazers to be your own resistance and add color and your own hilo to the tapestry, whatever that may be and wherever you may be. So I'll hand it over to the women.
Thank you for that introduction. So, who would like to go first?
Go, Virginia, go.
Go first. So, yes, I was born and raised in Chicago, true Chicago, and although I live in a suburb now, but we learn a lot from our families. And my mother used to say about anybody who was being difficult, she's had a hard life, or he's had a hard life. She had a very hard life. She was born in Waco, Texas, actually, and hitchhiked with her mom and her older sister to Chicago. I don't know what year that was, but I know she ended up spending the Great Depression in an orphanage in Indiana. So she remembered all of those, things that happened to her in the orphanage and being separated from her mother. She was reunited with her mother after she got out of the orphanage. But that kind of gives us, a framework of who we are as well. And she had also been sexually abused before she even left Texas. So there were just pieces of things that happened that as you're growing up, you just like, why is she like that? Why? And then later on, you find out why. But that also contributes to strength that you receive and that you get and that you feel. So when I was graduating from high school, I was in honors classes. I did well, but I had no intention of going to college. I was going to get married. And my typing teacher sent me to junior college here in Chicago to find out about a program. And I went and they tested me. Oh, we'd love to have you. And I said, but I want to work. And they said, oh, part of the program is you work. You go to school in the morning, you work in the afternoon, we'll find you a job downtown. I already had a job, which I kept for a while. So I ended up going to Loop College, it's called downtown, and working in the afternoon, getting my AA degree, and then worked full-time in an insurance company during the Vietnam War and all things that were going on in Pilsen with more gang activity, people dying, just a lot of things going on. And I sat there and, child of the 60s, if you're not a part of the solution, then you're a part of the problem. So I decided I was going to go back to school. And my boss at the insurance company wanted me to stay for another year because he was going to retire. And I said, no, I'm not going to stay because you're retiring. And in the meantime, I had gotten a part-time job with a law office in the Pilsen neighborhood where Mary and I both have worked, and she still is. And it was called Reyes and Lopez. And I got to see even more problems. So I decided that I wanted to go back. And I went to University of Illinois, Chicago in sociology, was planning to be a social worker. I kept my part-time job, and the attorneys asked me, what are you going to do now that you're graduating from college? And I said, I'm going to go to the School of Social Work. And they said, no, we really need bilingual attorneys. And through them, I had met all 15 of them in the state of Illinois at the time, Latino attorneys. and no women. And it hadn't really hit me that there were no women. But I agreed with them and I said, yeah. So I ended up going to law school. My parents, in the meantime, had moved to Eagle Pass, Texas. I do have connections to Texas. And when I told my mom I was going to continue to go to school, she said, why? They treat you so well at that law firm. You know, why do you want to keep going to school? And I said, Mom, I'm on the wrong side of the desk. And that was that. So, but I was so poor that I got a full scholarship, which is unheard of now, a full scholarship to law school. And I kept my job with those lawyers for another year. But this chapter really talks about that issue of, you know, you don't really see models. I ended up that my role models were these two men, plus Judge Cerda, who I'd met in the meantime as well. He is now a retired justice of the Appellate Court of Illinois. And so they had that influence on me because there were no women models until I got to law school. And none in Chicago, but I met Vilma Martínez, who later became president of MALDEF, and Graciela Olivares, who had graduated as the first woman to graduate from Notre Dame Law School in Indiana. So they became my role models. And when I graduated from law school, when I was going to graduate, I ran into Vilma again at a conference. And she said, well, you know, what are you going to do? And I would always raise my hand when she was speaking and say, but you fly over Chicago. Why doesn't MALDEF do anything in Chicago? And I kept asking her that. And then she finally said, why don't you do something? Why don't you come to an intern extra program that we have at MALDEF? At the time, their national office was in San Francisco. So I did do that. And I became an intern there and then came back and opened up my private practice. A few years later, they did open up an office in Chicago and I became the associate counsel. But my chapter starts with what that means to have all those responsibilities on your shoulders. So I'm going to read really quickly the poem that I wrote back then. I was 31 years old. So young and so active in community affairs, so much energy and commitment and so aware. You're a lawyer, a Chicana, you're on your way to success and happiness. That's what they say. But how could they know how I really feel? Pressure, demands, and expectations unreal. A Chicana, a lawyer, an animal so rare. I try to hide, but I don't know where. Criticism comes, I don't even ask. Too aggressive, too confident, or is it a mask? You turn people off with all of your talk. Take a softer approach, or the men will balk. I must be strong, or I will never survive. But I'm tired and confused, and I need time. Who am I really? I don't even know. A busy schedule, but no time to grow. My friends see my needs and give me support, but they are too busy and caught in the mess that constrains but is labeled success. So that was part of my first experience with MALDEF. So that was the second time I worked for MALDEF. Later on, I worked a third time for MALDEF. I left after the redistricting cases that Leticia referenced, which really put me on the map in terms of Chicago. I was, excuse me, on the news every night. We were fighting against the whole Democratic Party, Illinois, and city of Chicago. But so it was just very, very difficult work, but we made it, we won. But I left. I decided I didn't like litigation. I went on and did some other work. And then I came back to MALDEF as a legislative staff attorney. I didn't want to run the office anymore. And I ended up coming back when all the Midwest states, many of them were in their legislatures were considering bills that were very anti-immigrant. So that was my work, working with all of our neighboring states and Illinois to combat all of these really bad bills that we're going through. So It's been I did lots of different things. I changed jobs a lot for very different reasons. And in my last job, I was on the prisoner review board, and it was really very difficult. It was during the pandemic, and we'd have to drive to Springfield, which is 3.5 hours away from Chicago, a couple of times a month, several times a month, and stay there for 2 or 3 days. The cases were very difficult. And I just said, I'm done. By that time, my first grandchild was born. And that's when I started writing my children's books, because I was so glad to be a grandma. So that's really how my life has changed over time. But it's also what I write about in the chapter is really the lessons that I learned along the way about having friends, about seeking help, being able to ask for help, about always including young people in everything that you do. It's just looking at the things that I've done, but gleaning from them lessons that I hope that will help others. So that was my chapter.
That is amazing. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Mary, but then I want to come back and ask you a couple of questions.
Well, I was in the same neighborhood with Virginia when she was doing so many of these incredible things. And I remember going to her with various ideas or various concerns that I had. I was born and raised in Chicago, and I'm a high school graduate. And the only thing I could brag about was that I graduated at the top of my class, and I typed faster than anybody else in the school. And they were manual typewriters in those days, right? So I could do 72 words a minute, and I was very good at it. And I was a straight A student. But my teacher cried when I left because I was at the top of my class and I wasn't going to college. And she said, why? And I said, I have no desire because I've got to help my father. And I was the oldest of 11. And my father was a steel worker doing labor work in a steel mill. My mother was a homemaker taking care of a disabled little boy and an elderly father who had lost a leg to diabetes, and plus the rest of the children. And so I just wanted to get out there and work and become a partner to my dad. And so that's what I did. My dad thought that if I was a good girl, which I was, a responsible girl, which I was, and if I learned all the important things about a household, like knowing how to sew, which I know how to sew, if I could learn how to make tortillas, and I did, and learn how to take care of children, and I did, that he imagined that I would marry and also have a large family, and he would advise me to, just stay out of other people's business, be a good human being, pay my bills, raise my children, go to church, and that life would be okay. And I tried it, and life sucked. It was terrible because I was living in the same poverty that my parents had lived in. But I had a mother who was angry about the fact that she couldn't find anywhere for my little brother. And there were zero services, and he was born in 1950. So there was nothing for him. And so he was to be home. And he was brain damaged as a result of spinal meningitis. And because he was born a healthy baby. But anyway, as the years passed and he kept growing and she was more and more desperate, I began to team up with her as a young woman, saying, "What could we do, Mom? What could we do?" And in 1968, a law was passed in Illinois that said that if if you had a child who had a disability and the public school system could not take care of them or could not provide them services, that a community-based organization could be funded to do just that. And so we set out to build our first project. And so we spent a couple of years on that. And in those days, this was the 60s, the late 60s and the early 70s, and the world was in conflict. And everyone was in confrontation and arrests and all kinds. So I was being exposed to young organizers who had moved into the neighborhood and were kind of agitating us. And so I used a lot of those methods, and I wasn't always successful, but successful enough that we were able to create 2 programs for Bobby. But then I began to get involved, and my mother did too, in Pilsen Neighbors Community Council, which was a local organization here. And that's where these organizers were hanging out. And I hated them and I loved them. I hated them because they were agitating me to do things that terrified me. And I loved them because they seemed to be creating like some successes, or at least what I was considering successes. And there was a lot of violence in the community, and it wasn't so much among the people as it was police against Mexican people, government against Mexican people. People were the people who had lived there before were leaving the neighborhood, and there was a lot of tension and a lot of animosity and a lot of pain. And now I understand that, but I was very young. I didn't understand why they were so angry at us. But anyway, so I began to get involved in the organization, and the next thing I knew, I was the president of the organization, and the next thing I know, we were fighting for a high school, and now I had gained confidence in this whole arena of confrontation, and I got good at it because I was never arrested. I could always manage not to be arrested, but create enough, participate in enough confrontation that it would force something to happen. And so I did that as a leader, and I was raising children, and at that time I had 5. I had 5 children, 3 that were my biological children and 2 that were not. And they were all little girls, and they were all beautiful. And I was trying to raise all these little kids. And in the process, I wound up being a single parent. My husband decided he didn't want to live with someone who was out, in confrontations and meetings and such. So anyway, but it worked out. 7 years later, I remarried, and I married an organizer. In fact, I married one of those crazy organizers that was agitating me and that I wasn't sure I liked. But I married him, and then we set out. And I think it came from all of this feeling for justice and anger about inequities. I think it all was rooted in my mother's experience, that I remember I was a young married person, and I had 2 little children at the time. And I said to her, I want to go to North Dakota, Mom, because I want to see where you grew up. And you have to go with me. I want to see. And she said, I will never, ever return to that godforsaken land. And she wouldn't go. And I said, oh, okay, and because she suffered so much, not only in North Dakota, but in Minnesota and in various Midwestern states. And she had vivid stories of the abuse imposed upon her siblings, and her father, because she lost her mother very young, and how abusive the farmers were. And I remember hearing these stories. And by the time I'm 12 or 13, I'm watching how people treat my parents. And I don't necessarily like how some of the people that my parents interacted with, how they were treated. And my parents are such beautiful, respectful human beings. And so I had grown up believing, I was a young girl in the late 40s and early 50s when all you saw in a movie was cowboy movies and war movies. Mm-hmm. And I was always so impressed that in war movies, the United States were the heroes, and we were the good people, and we took care of everyone in the world, and we loved everyone in the world, and that's what I believed. So desperately that by the time I was 14, we used to have Flag Day, and the 8th graders would hang the flag, would go out in white dresses, and I didn't have a white dress. But I knew that I had to do it. And so I came home. I went to school one day, and the teacher said, this had to be the 13th of June. I went to school. And she said, how many of you have white dresses? And I raised my hand. And I didn't have a white dress. And she said, okay, she named us all. And she said, tomorrow you have to wear your white dress because we're going to have the ceremony. And you're going to have to go out to the schoolyard, and you're going to have to raise the flag. So I went home crying, and I said to my mother, I need a white dress. So my mother was up all night bleaching a yellow dress I owned so that I could raise that flag. But by the time I was 15 or 16, I began to understand that it wasn't what I thought. And I think it was a lot of my mother's experiences, her stories, her anger about Bobby, her desire to do something, and her lack of faith in doctors or anyone who told her anything about what Bobby could or could not do. My mother said, that's not true. And they said, he won't live to be 10 years old. He died at the age of 33. He'll never speak. He not only spoke, he argued, he sang, he cried, he yelled, he did everything. He's not going to walk. He walked, he ran, he did it. So my mother said, you can't believe anybody. And that was instilled in my brain, like question everything, right? So I entered organizing with my second husband, and I had an incredible life. I always felt stupid because, number one, I was the first Latina to enter it here in Chicago. I was the first woman. I was the only Latina woman in this group of organizers. They were all highly educated men, and I was a high school graduate. But I had one thing over them. I had led or participated in at least 500 public actions, where there was confrontation and negotiation and police and everything, and they had not. And so they had studied it, they had read about it, they had ideas about it, but they hadn't actually lived it. And so I think that helped me a lot. And so I had 30 incredible years. I traveled all over the world. I organized I helped to build organizations in South Africa and Great Britain, all over the United States. I met fabulous people everywhere I went who were struggling in their own way to find justice in the world, to become leaders in their lives, to figure out how they were going to help their children, how they were going to help themselves. And I think every place I went, I was inspired by that passion that people had. And so I decided at some point, I said, something happened to me in Pilsen. And it took about 3 years. But there was a phenomenal transition that I experienced. And I thought, how do I help other people experience the same transition? And so that became my life's work. So to this day, I'm 84 now. I've got friends all over the country, who still call me or send me notes, or some of them actually show up in Chicago. But I think I had an incredible life. My children grew up. They're all professionals. They're all really great parents. They're really great human beings. And I think the challenge is that, the work that my mother began and then I followed has to continue to be followed by the next generation and the generation after that.
Wow, thank you. I want to encourage anyone who's watching, if you have a question for our guests, please put it in the chat and we will try to get it answered. But I certainly have some questions I wanted to share. For Virginia, we actually have Vilma Martínez coming here to San Antonio at the end of May. To talk about the 50th anniversary of the 1975 Voting Rights Act extension. So that was a bit exciting to hear you mention her. She actually originally is from San Antonio, but she spent most of her career in California.
Right.
But I wanted to ask you about the children's books, because one of the things that we talk about a lot at MACRI is that you've got your very obvious civil rights issues like voting rights, access to healthcare, access to education. But one area that I think of as also being important, just so that we can get to that, is just to be seen. When we're not seen, it's hard to even explain to people, well, we're being denied X, Y, and Z rights.
Right.
So the children's books really fascinates me. Can you tell us more about the books you've written?
Well, go back again to my mom. My mom, we didn't have a lot of money, but we always had books in the house. We were kids. We had a little bookcase. We had a little couch with dolls. Dolls have another story with my mom, but we always had dolls. We had books. And they even bought an Encyclopedia Britannica that somebody would come every week, and you would pay a couple of dollars every week for the encyclopedia to make the whole set. And so And then she also took, because my mom drove. My dad had a steel accident and he couldn't drive. He couldn't move his right foot, right leg. So she drove, or we would take the bus, and we would go to all the museums in the city of Chicago and the zoos. I was the youngest, so there were 6 of us total. The oldest 2 were in the Army when I was born. They were my dad's children. His first wife died, and then my mom had 4. I was the youngest one. So my sister and I, she's the next youngest. My sister and I, by that time, were the ones that were going with my mom. My brothers were off doing whatever. But she would take us to all of these museums, and so we all did well in school. My parents wanted us all to graduate from high school. They had not. My mom had only had a year or 2 when she was in the orphanage, and my dad came at the age of 14 from Mexico, and never finished. I think only maybe 6th grade in Mexico. But so we had this experience. And my sister too, we always did well in school, partly because we had that experience of having books, our parents telling us, you need to do well, you need to read, especially my mom. My dad worked nights most of the time, so it was my mom who was home for homework. Even though she hadn't graduated from high school, she knew it was important, and she would make sure we did our homework. She would make sure we had books, things that we needed. And so every time, that's part of what I said in my chapter was, I always did well in school. When I decided I was going to go to junior college, law school, I had the grades. I always had the grades. So I could do whatever I decided I was going to do now. And so I did the same with my children, took them everywhere. They did well in school. And then when my grandchildren were born, of course, we're going to go as a family. We're going to go to the zoos. We're going to go to the museums. And I started writing Facebook posts called Adventures with Abuela. And people said, you should write a book. And so that's how it started. So there's a book. The first one was about Brookfield Zoo. Again, it was during the pandemic, so at least you could still go to the zoo, the outside part. You couldn't go in the buildings, but we would go to the outside part. And so that was the first book that I published. Then the next one was the aquarium, then the Museum of Science and Industry, and then the last one was the Adler Planetarium and the eclipse last year. So they're bilingual books written in English and in Spanish, because I wanted to make sure that parents and grandparents who didn't read English could still read to their children in something that was available, to encourage them also to take their children to these places that we have. We have incredible museums in Chicago, incredible. So that's how these books started. So it was my grandson Rio, who's now 5.5. And now I'm not writing a book this year, but next year I've got to write another book, because the star of the book has to be Liliana, who's 2.5. So that's how that came about. It's really an intention of trying to help other families access. They really don't know about these wonderful museums that we have. And I usually put in there, here's the website, look for free days, go to the library, take out a pass. You can get free passes to these places if you go to the library. So that's, and again, at that point, that's when I started writing the books, that's when I decided I was going to quit my job, not retire exactly, but I did retire my law license. So
I love that, because I think it's so important that Mexican Americans and all people of color understand that these kind of grand institutions like museums are also for us.
Yes.
That we have a right to be in those spaces and to feel comfortable in those spaces. So that's wonderful. Mary, I wanted to ask you mentioned that you had young kids when you really got moving in your life as an activist. How does one balance, or how does one deal with, or maybe you just didn't have this issue, but fear of if I'm too outspoken, if I'm doing too much advocacy work, that there could be backlash, and that I could put myself, my family into some kind of financial harm, or just fear in general. Is that something you experienced?
Well, I think there's always fear. There's always fear, and what you got to do is you've got to decide that you're going to face the fear. Because if you don't face fear, I mean, I'm 84. I still fear things that I want to do. I'm afraid it'll collapse. I'm afraid it won't work. But you've got to be courageous enough to say it's important enough that I'm going to move forward. But I think the other thing that was present at that time is I was a nobody. I was very poor. I didn't have much. I had nothing to lose. How could anybody punish me other than arrest me? And I became smart enough not to cause so much trouble that I would be arrested. So I was very cautious about that because I had little kids at home. But I had not. There was nothing anyone could take from me. They couldn't take a job away from me. They couldn't take a grant away from me. They couldn't take a position away from me, a title. They had nothing to take from me, and so I had nothing to lose. And I think that was generally true for a lot of the people that I was working with at that time. It was a thriving, very immigrant, much more immigrant community than it is today. Much higher percentage of undocumented people here, and some of the great heroes in the fight for Benito Juarez were undocumented people. And I used to tell everyone I loved working with them because they were courageous, they were visionary, they worked so hard, they took so much risk to be in this country undocumented. They were risking everything, but the dream they had was so powerful that they had to overcome that fear, or they had to deal with that on a day-to-day basis. Every day they had to deal with that fear. And they were incredible, far more effective than working with U.S. citizens. I found them much easier to work with, and there was much more passion, much more excitement, and we won the school. And I've told everyone who's interested, it was the undocumented people of Pilsen that won that school. Certainly, I was a leader, but there was a team probably of 50 people who were leading the campaign. And I think of the 50 people that were leading the campaign, maybe 4 or 5 of us were bilingual.
Wow.
And the rest
And
of
lots
the
of
people,
women, mostly women.
and mostly women, and some of the people had some bilingualism available to them, but their primary language was Spanish. And the funniest thing that ever happened to me is I initially did not want to get into this campaign because I think I was afraid. And so I kept rejecting, no, don't invite me, I'm not coming. And one day, one of the organizers said to me, I'm taking a busload of people to the Board of Education tomorrow. I have no one who's bilingual. You have to be there to help translate for the people. And I said, oh, John, I don't want it. And he said, please, Mary, just come to translate. Bring the kids. We'll take them in the bus. And so I did that. And I got to the Board of Education, and now it was time to testify. And we had everybody signed up. And this little lady who was probably 4 feet tall, an elderly lady, an elderly Mexican lady, she wanted to speak. And they had to bring a little stool for her to stand up so that she could reach the microphone. And I stood next to her. And she started to speak, and I started to translate. And one of the board members said, what's wrong with you people? When are you going to learn English? Right? And I just felt the heat, and I just said, Mary, don't get caught up in this, So I just continued to translate for her. And then again, the same woman said, you're in the United States. You're not in Mexico. So I translated this for this lady, and this little old lady lifted her fist like this, and she started screaming at them in a dialect I didn't understand. and they were saying to me, what is she saying? What is she saying? I said, I don't know. You've made her so angry. She's now speaking in a dialect that I don't speak. Well, that wonderful little old lady wound up being the the key to naming the school Benito Juarez. She organized and organized everywhere. And the day of the election, hundreds of people came to St. Procopio School Hall to vote on the name. And it was very, very tenseful because there were groups supporting all kinds of different names. And we just wanted a democratic process. And her name won. And she came up to me and she said to me in Spanish, "No me dejes sola. Don't leave me alone here." Because she was afraid of the people from the other groups. But I loved her passion, and I loved her courage, and I loved her guts and her age. She was elderly. She must have been 75. And there she was in the middle of the fight, defending her right to say it should be called Benito Juarez. And it is Benito Juarez. So they were, I think, the energy for me. They were and to this day, you know, I'm a Mexican American, but I think my heart is with immigrants. It always has been. And that experience just deepened it. You know, it gave me the opportunity to actually work with them. And I began to understand it. And when I went to Mexico with Mayor Harold Washington many years ago, one of the mayor's people said something that I thought was rather insulting to the commissioner of education. And this man was speaking in Spanish, and he had a translator. And suddenly he told the translator, "Stop." And he began to talk to us in English, beautiful English. And apparently he had come to the United States and graduated from Harvard. Anyway, he said, "What you don't understand is the hardworking, visionary, aggressive, people who want something to happen in their lives. They go to the United States. Who do you think stays in Mexico?" And he was implying that lazy people stayed in Mexico. And he said, "And you are benefiting." And he just was very angry with with Harold Washington's staff person. But it connected to me because I said, yes, that was my experience with Benito Juarez. He's absolutely right. I'd never thought about it that way. So I think that it was a gift to me because I grew up in Hyde Park, which is a neighbor. At that time, it was an all-white neighborhood, and I was the only Spanish-speaking child in the school. And so I couldn't speak for more than a year because I had no one to speak to, and I didn't know how to speak English. But in 14 years, I lost my language because there was no one to talk to. And then I came to Pilsen, and here I was in the middle of a bunch of Mexicans, and I thought, I've got to regain this language, and I did. And I'm eternally grateful to the people of Pilsen because it gave me the chance to do that.
Immigrants are risk takers.
They are.
How they came.
Because
that's why they
that's
came.
how they got in the country.
And mothers and grandmothers will fight for their children and rights and opportunities that they didn't have. So
Absolutely.
When you get a bunch of women, and especially if they're mothers and grandmothers, together to do something that's going to benefit the community and benefit their children, they're going to do everything possible to reach their goals.
Absolutely. I mean, one example was my mother, God love her. She was a fighter. I was at Mass the other day, about 3 weeks ago, and I was saying to someone, "Oh, you're not going to believe it. I just turned 84. And right behind me, my pastor was standing behind me talking to someone else, and he tapped me on the shoulder. And he said, and I turned around and he said, "This lady's going to be 90. And I looked at this woman, and she was stunningly beautiful. You know, I couldn't help it. I had to reach over and touch her face. I said, "You're going to be 90? And she smiled at me. She didn't say anything. And I'm chatting away with her, right? And I'm waiting for her to say something. And finally she says, "I loved your mother."
Yes.
I said, "You knew my mother? My mother's been gone 24 years. I loved your mother. Your mother was incredible." And then she went into these long line of stories of things that my mother did that she was part of. And she said she would get us our eyes examined for free. We'd get glasses for free. I don't know how she convinced people to get us a bus, and they would take us to a restaurant and we'd all eat. And so she went on. And I thought to myself, holy cow, here's my mother presenting herself again 24 years later through this woman. So I'm very fortunate to live in this neighborhood.
Well, we have a wonderful question from an audience member that I want to share, and feel free to anybody jump in. But what organizing tactics that you used in the past do you think are still useful in today's age? And what are some new approaches that you think are useful now that perhaps weren't used in the past?
Well, let me give you a short answer to that. I think organizing the way I learned it is dead. People don't want to do it anymore because they depend on text messaging. They depend on not phone calls, emails, on Instagram, and they don't talk to each other anymore. And people get to have to build relationships with one another because it's all a matter of power. And power is organized people and organized resources. And when people don't organize, then the people who do organize always win. And, you look at what we've got right now in the White House. Now you got to give him the credit. He organized. He organized an awful lot of people and an awful lot of money to win that spot. And everybody else was acting as many of everybody else, not everybody else, but a lot of other people were just acting as individuals, thinking that if they just went and voted, that it was going to make a difference. And it didn't, because people are no longer organizing. I met with a young organizer today, and I said, how many one-on-one conversations are you having with potential leaders you want to work with? And she said, oh, about 5 or 6 a week. I said, it should be 20. When I was training organizers, I'd say the first 3 months you do 20 one-on-ones a week, and then come and talk to me about the neighborhood. Until then, don't tell me anything. But all of that has gone. And I think there's people on the streets, young people, hungry to know what to do. But there haven't been professional organizers on the streets in the last 25 years. At least from my opinion. And I was taught the Solinsky methodology, and that's what I lived all my 30 years as an organizer. Now, some people don't like that methodology, but it worked for me, so I used it. But I think a lot of that is still available if people are willing to get off text messaging, get off emails, and go and sit down and talk to people and begin to build groups of people and just say, who else can you bring? And then who else can you bring? And then who else can you bring? That's how we won Benito. We didn't win Benito Juarez because we were right. We won Benito Juarez because we shut down LaSalle Street, because we crowded their board meetings so nobody else could get in except people from Pilsen, because we did actions on the superintendent, because we were relentless. And it was thousands of people acting. Right, so we shut down 7 public schools for 3 days, and so that's why we won. We didn't win because the Chicago public school system said, "Oh my God, they're right. Mexicans need a school in that neighborhood." No, we won because we fought, and people want to be lazy now. They don't want to fight. They just want it to happen if they go and vote. And I say, get up off your ass and do something different. What do you think, Virginia? What would you add to that?
I think about all the lawsuits that are going on right now, and that there is still hope that the justice system will prevail. The problem is, of course, who's on the Supreme Court. But,
right.
There's the hope that some of them will actually,
do the right thing.
The constitutional law classes that they took, and will look at precedent and will do something. And they have done a little bit. The rest of the cases are on their way, but that was all set up to be this way. It was, he couldn't do all of this stuff in his first term because he didn't have everything he's got now. He's got all of these people who are afraid of him behind him, and the court system, which is the last resort. He's got the Supreme Court and a bunch of appellate courts in across the country. But I still think I'm still supporting the ACLU, and
Me too.
Hoping that they are able to do some things, because I don't know how it's going to change unless we can get masses of people. As I mentioned yesterday when we did a presentation, I went to the Women's March on Saturday, and I was actually crying because this is my 50th anniversary from graduating and becoming a lawyer this year. And Roe v. Wade was announced, was decided while I was in law school. There were a bunch of cases on discrimination, on women's rights in employment, and a bunch of other things that happened in those early years that I sat there and thought, and now 50 years later, we're going to have to do the same thing over again, or something. We're going to have to do something, because everything we worked for more than 50 years is going down the drain.
Right. And I quite honestly think it's our fault that we're where we are, because too many people are too willing to believe that now everything is okay. Everything is not okay.
No,
In
absolutely
fact, it's
not.
worse than ever. And I think organizers, there's a lot of people in the country who call themselves organizers. I get offended, because I'm a professional organizer and I know what an organizer looks like. And I think what they may be saying is, I want to be an organizer. And I think that's great. I would love to see more professional organizers really trained and get into the streets and start organizing people by the thousands. That's the only thing that I think is ever going to always assure that we have a chance at keeping our democracy. Democracy does not fall out of the sky. It has to be fought for every day of your life. You got to fight for it. And if you don't fight for it, you can't be surprised by the result.
Yes. Lots at stake right now. There is
lots at stake. A lot at stake. And I wish I was 40 again, because I'd be out on the streets. I'm 84. My knees don't want to work anymore, but I'm still doing everything that I can. And I think every single person, I don't care if you're 84 or 79, or you got to get in the fight.
I still go out on the street.
Me too.
When I can.
I walk slowly, Virginia, but I'm still out there.
I walk slowly, and I sit down wherever I can find. I now have a cane that's got a little seat in it, so I can, walk if I need it. I can take my cane, and then I know I'll find a place to sit.
Right. I'm gonna get a cane too. I've got it, but I don't use it. I'm gonna start.
No, I don't use mine either, mostly, but for those purposes, just in case there's no benches around.
Or to hit someone over the head and say, "Wake up."
This has been a delightful conversation, and I hope that folks who are watching, I think I'm picking this up from the comments that we're getting. I hope that it's just inspiring to hear these women who really were and are trailblazers, that we younger folks can pick up the torch and keep carrying it, right?
Absolutely.
So, these stories and more can be found in Chicago Latina Trailblazers, and I put the link for how you can find this book in the chat. Again, what a delight to get to speak directly with the two of you tonight. And thank you, Leticia, for putting this book together, because I think you've brought together stories that really needed to be documented. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to thank all of the folks who watched tonight. And I know one of the beautiful things about this platform is that people will keep watching it. So we want to thank all of you for tuning in and supporting MACRI, the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. I also need to thank our sponsors. Our programs are funded in part by the City of San Antonio Department of Arts and Culture, Bexar County, the Mellon Foundation, the John L. Santikos Charitable Fund of the San Antonio Area Foundation, Spurs Give, and individual donors. Mil gracias for all of your support. If you liked tonight's presentation, we always have more things coming down the pipeline. In fact, next Tuesday, we'll be continuing our Latina Spring Film Series, which is our annual way of celebrating Latina filmmakers during Women's History Month. So this was next Tuesday at the UNAM San Antonio campus. It's free. Parking is also free after 5 o'clock. We hope you can join us for that. And then right now at the MACRI Visitor Center, we have an art exhibit, Si Se Puede. This is student art inspired by Dolores Huerta, another amazing activist who is turning 95 next month. Come and see the exhibit here. I encourage you to learn more about MACRI by visiting somosmacri.org, where you can find a complete list of our upcoming programs. Did you know We are building the nation's first museum dedicated to Mexican American civil rights history. Yes, and we need your support. So please visit the website, subscribe to our newsletter, and learn how you can support us. Thank you again, Leticia, Virginia, and Mary. It was so wonderful talking to you tonight. And I hope everyone has a great evening, and good luck to us all.
Thank you.
Sarah.
Good night.
Good night.
Yes.